Here we will discuss the concept of inclusive growth related to sustainable economic growth, human development, and various strategies for inclusive growth. Now, what is inclusive growth? Economic growth was earlier seen as an inclusive concept. When you had economic growth, the idea was that you achieved growth for all the various sections of the population. The entire economy benefited from it. But gradually it was found out that the benefits of growth, maybe they are accruing to the economy, but they are not percolating to all sections of the society. And this really brought in this new concept of growth that is inclusive. The concept of inclusive growth, really, the term as such, really was coined by Montek Singh Ahluwalia, chairman of the Planning Commission of India. It is he who made this term popular, he who highlighted it. Before that, the term was not so much in currency. Now, inclusive growth has become, especially with the 11th and the 12th plan, a very, very potent tool in the hands of the government to usher in economic progress.
After studying this module, you shall be able to know what inclusive growth is, learn how inclusive growth emerged as a concept, identify policies towards inclusive growth, evaluate the effectiveness of such policies towards inclusive growth, and analyze inclusive growth in relation to sustainable growth and human development. In the words of P. Chidambaram, growth, though crucial for reducing the level of poverty and improving the living standards of our people, is not enough by itself. It needs to be more inclusive, more widespread, and accompanied by moderate inflation. Deepak Dasgupta, a leading economist with the World Bank, says that there are two Indias. While India's top students at the best educational institutions are setting global standards, many, if not most of the country's children leave government primary schools with few basic skills. While we have medical tourism from abroad, most primary health centers do not function well. While the Tatas and the Mittals are acquiring global companies, our villages lack most of the basic amenities. While the price of urban property is escalating, the level of stunting and undernutrition amongst the poor is alarming. The term inclusive growth has been coined by Montek Singh Ahluwalia, chairman of the Planning Commission of India. The India Development Policy Review 2006, titled Inclusive Growth and Service Delivery, Building on India's Success, brought the term inclusive growth into prominence. Inclusive growth has thus emerged as a concept in economics. This is reflected in India's 11th five-year plan, 2007 to 2012, that had the theme towards faster and more inclusive growth. The approach to the 12th five-year plan was titled Faster, Sustainable, and More Inclusive Growth. The concept of inclusive growth emphasizes that equitable opportunities for economic participants should be provided during the very process of economic growth, with benefits being incurred by every section of society. It is distinct from the concept of equity, social justice, or redistribution taking place in terms of policy measures taken after the growth process. In economics, the three activities of production, consumption, and distribution have traditionally been treated as distinct activities or processes. Growth and development are associated with production, whereas equity and social justice are associated with distribution. But the inclusive growth concept puts these two together. It refers to productive activity bound up with distributive activity. The India Development Policy Review 2006, described inclusive growth in terms of challenges facing India today: improving the delivery of core public services, maintaining rapid growth while spreading the benefits of this growth more widely. According to it, promoting inclusive growth includes revamping labor regulations, improving agricultural technology and infrastructure, helping lagging sections and regions catch up, and empowering the poor through proactive policies that help them to take part in the market on fair and equitable terms. The definition of inclusive growth has been said to imply links between the macroeconomic and microeconomic determinants of the economy, to have changes in economic aggregates as well as structural transformation.
What about sustainable growth? Sustainable economic growth has also become a very important term these days. Growth that really occurs at the cost of resources which nature has endowed the economy with cannot be sustained. You may grow fast, you may have a high rate of growth, but then the future generations will have no coal left, no natural resources, no water resources left. So one has also to bring in what is known as intergenerational equity. You must not only try to have growth for the present and the immediate future, but also for the distant future. This is sustainable growth, growth that can be sustained not only for the present generation or maybe one next generation, but for very many generations, for towards the end of the human development of all. Human beings, as long as they exist, they have a right to the natural resources, and that you must not consume up. So this kind of sustainable economic growth is inclusive growth, because you are including the future generations, you are including the posterity, you are including various people all over, all the countries over, and also the future generations. So sustainable growth and inclusive growth are very much related. In fact, you cannot have one without the other.
Sustainable economic growth and inclusive growth. Sustainable development and inclusive growth are dependent on each other. To be sustainable, growth needs to be inclusive. Economic growth may give rise to inequalities and corruption. Certain sections of the population may benefit to the exclusion of others. There may not be equality of opportunity in terms of access to markets, resources, and unbiased regulatory environment for businesses and individuals. Especially in the short run, growth may seem to make the rich richer and the poor poorer. The inclusive growth approach takes a longer term perspective, emphasizing productive employment as a means of increasing the incomes and therefore the living standards of the poor and excluded groups.
This brings us to another concept, the concept of human development and its relationship with inclusive growth. Human development is not just growth in terms of national income or gross domestic product, it also takes account of literacy, it also takes account of longevity, life expectations, and so on. So, in this sense, human development has to be inclusive. If you have growth but you do not manage literacy, life expectation, etc., to go up for all sections of the society, if women are left out, if education, school education, skill formation, all these things are left out, if infant mortality remains high, then however high a growth rate you may have, you cannot call it inclusive growth, nor can you call it human development. So human development and inclusive growth are very, very related concepts. Subir Gokarn, an economist of great repute, has said that there are several considerations to be incorporated when we talk of inclusive growth. One is opportunity. All sections of the economy must have some equality of opportunity. Capability. All sections should be made capable. Access. All sections should be ensured of access to the same objectives as the others. And then security. All sections of the economy must be secure, not only from law and order, etc., these things, but also in terms of food security and so on. It is with this in mind that several strategies have been suggested for inclusive growth.
Let us discuss human development and inclusive growth. Human development and inclusive growth are closely related. Growth which is not inclusive cannot in fact achieve the literacy and life expectancy levels required for satisfactory human development. Simply a high rate of GDP, even if it is at PPP US dollars, whose benefits do not percolate to all economic classes, is neither inclusive nor human. Only by reaching literacy and good health to all, and only by ensuring better public distribution system, can a higher HDI be reached. Human development, which is about expanding people's choices, builds on shared natural resources. Promoting human development requires addressing sustainability locally, nationally, and globally. And this can and should be done in ways that are equitable and empowering. In 2007, at the 8th Dr. R. L. Sanghvi AMA Endowment Lecture titled Inclusive Growth in India, Dream or Reality, delivered at the Ahmedabad Management Association on December 6, 2007, economist Subir Gokarn has stated that inclusive growth is a process in which economic growth, measured by a sustained expansion in GDP, contributes to an enlargement of the scale and scope of all four of the following considerations, namely opportunity, capability, access, and security.
P. Chidambaram, a very important economist as well as a very important government official, has pointed out that one needs to formulate a strategy to make India's growth more inclusive. He has stressed upon improving agriculture. Agriculture as well as manufacturing, these two are very important sectors of the economy. Chidambaram has said that unless you include agricultural growth, then simply having manufacturing growth is not going to be enough. So you need to grow, you need to industrialize, but you need to include, that is, have inclusive growth in respect of agriculture, rural sector, forestry, fishery, all these aspects together. He has also pointed out that labor participation has also to be improved. The workers are the people who create GDP. So unless there is inclusion of labor, of workers, unless the labor participation is improved, we cannot have economic growth of any kind, inclusive or otherwise. Similarly, inflation, price stability, fiscal balance, fiscal consolidation, these two have to be incorporated in the strategy. Now, following this kind of opinion, various government officials and so on have chalked out the 11th plan program and also the 12th plan program, which gave special importance to very many programs such as the Indira Awas Yojana, Sarva Shiksha Abhijan, midday meal scheme, and so on. These, if you look up the planning commission reports, if you look up the plan documents, you will get a good idea of all these programs that promote inclusiveness. However, it has also been recorded that assessing the progress towards inclusiveness is not very easy, and we cannot really say how much it has been successful.
Strategy for inclusive growth, policies and their impact. Let us start with P. Chidambaram's strategy to make India's growth more inclusive. P. Chidambaram says, the first need of India is making the growth more inclusive. This would require increasing the growth rates of the agriculture and allied sectors. With just around 18% share in GDP and more than half of the population dependent on agriculture, average income in agriculture is less than a quarter compared to the rest of the economy. Unless growth in agricultural sector accelerates, along with a reduction in the number of persons dependent on this sector, relative deprivation of this sector would be present. The government has adopted the following four ways of improving the agricultural sector. 1. Augment the cropped area by raising irrigation and reclaiming wasteland. 2. Improve input delivery consisting of fertilizers, certified seeds, institutional credit, and a revamped training and visit system to improve the yield levels and to reduce spreads across farms and regions in productivity. 3. Improve the income levels. Instruments for that include support prices, agriculture insurance, and encouraging value-added agriculture through agro-processing, marketing, and storage. 4. Improve farm plus activities like animal husbandry, horticulture, and other related activities. The second need is improving the share of manufacturing. The growth of transport, storage, communications, insurance, banking, trade, and real estate has to be manufacturing driven. Apart from the enabling macroeconomic environment, what is critical for the sustained buoyancy in manufacturing would be the investment in research and technology, removal of the current mismatch in availability and need of skills, and the removal of infrastructural bottlenecks, both of physical and social infrastructure. The third need is improving labor participation rate. According to an ILO study, the labor force participation rate in India is 60.9% in the age group of 15 to 64 in 2005, and it was way behind India's 82%. There is a need for faster employment growth, not only absorbing the new entrants to the labor force, but also to meet the rise in labor force due to a higher participation rate. While a lower growth in labor force participation rate or a lower labor to population ratio in the short run may give a lower unemployment figure, we cannot afford to forego the potential output from such a valuable source. The fourth need is maintaining price stability. There does not appear to be any consistent relation between inflation and growth. While it is difficult to indicate the level of inflation beyond which it would start impinging on growth, tolerance to inflation may have declined over time, and a moderate inflation is necessary for a moderate interest rate regime and stable exchange rate. It is well known that inflation hurts the vulnerable sections the most. The fifth need is fiscal consolidation. This will not only improve the credibility of the government and reduce the crowding out, but it will also provide the needed fiscal space for allocating larger resources for capital investment, especially in social and economic infrastructure. Now we will move on to the various 11th Plan programs for inclusiveness. The 11th Plan gave a special impetus to several programs aimed at building rural and urban infrastructure and providing basic services with the objective of increasing inclusiveness and reducing poverty. Some of these programs were new, while others augmented existing initiatives. Let us look at the various 11th Plan programs for inclusiveness. Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, coming from the Ministry of Rural Development. Rajiv Gandhi Gramin Vidyutikaran Yojana, RGGVY. Indira Awas Yojana, IAY, for development of rural housing by the Department of Rural Development. National Rural Health Mission, Health and Family Welfare. National Social Assistance Program NSAP Rural Development. ICDS Women and Child Development. Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana Rural Development. Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission for Urban Development. Accelerated Irrigation Benefit Program AIBP and other waste resources program. Rajiv Gandhi Drinking Water Mission. NRDWP and Total Sanitation Campaign. Rashtriya Krishi Vikas Yojana Agriculture and Cooperation. Sarva Siksha Abhiyan SSA for school education and literacy. Midday Meal MDM school education and literacy. Most of these programs were centrally sponsored schemes, CSS, which are implemented by state government agencies but are largely funded by the central government with a defined state government share. The total expenditure on these schemes during the 11th plan period is almost rupees 7 lakh crores. Let us now analyze the assessment of progress towards inclusiveness. According to government assessment, an approach to the 12th five-year plan says that progress towards inclusiveness is difficult to assess because inclusiveness is a multidimensional concept. In regard to the programs for inclusiveness, it says that the effectiveness of their implementation varied from state to state, and there were reports of misuse of funds and leakages. However, that does not negate the overall impact of these programs. Academic assessment. Statistical measures of inclusiveness have been devised by M.H. Suryanarayan, Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research IGIDR, calculated on the basis of National Sample Survey data on consumer expenditure distribution for the years 2004-2005. The findings are as follows. Inclusion coefficients, IC, at the national level is 0.79 for the rural sector and 0.63 for the urban, which implies that the extent of inclusion is greater in the rural than in the urban sector at the all India level. Across states, the extent of inclusion of the deprived in the rural growth process is one of the highest, greater than 90% in the states of Bihar and Karnataka, and the lowest in Kerala. As regards the urban sector, the IC is the highest in Bihar and lowest in Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand, 0.53. Some further findings are consistent with the All India profile. The estimates of IC are generally higher for the rural sector than for the urban across states. As regards the rural sectors of the Bimaru states, that is, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, and Uttar Pradesh, the ICs are generally as high as the All India average. However, the extent of inclusion in the urban sectors of Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand is much less than the All India average. There are interstate variations in ICs, both in rural and urban sector. The range is higher for the urban than for the rural sector.
There has been some doubt as to whether inclusive growth is actually achievable. Is it an impossible ideal? Some people have even written and discussed this issue. Uttara Balkrishnan, for example, she has written that inclusive growth uh, implies a certain equitable allocation of resources which may be an utopia. utopia that is a kind of heaven, a kind of an ideal state towards which we all strive, but which is very difficult to actually reach. But afterwards, she herself, along with others, have reiterated that although it is an ideal, still we can certainly try to achieve it. This seeming utopia may be achieved, and the 11th plan approach paper and the various strategies have all emphasized this. In fact, even after coming of the new government, the new regime, our Prime Minister has also emphasized that economic benefits should accrue to the whole nation, and inclusive growth ideal should remain as an ideal of the Indian economy and certainly be reached.
Inclusive growth, an impossible ideal? There are some who question the very reality of the inclusive growth concept. Is it at all possible for an economy to grow, taking the various socio-economic sections with it? Isn't there always a cost to growth, a cost generally paid by the poor rather than the rich? Is not inclusive growth a utopian dream? Uttara Balakrishnan discusses this question with optimism. Inclusive growth, by its very definition, implies an equitable allocation of resources with benefits accruing to every section of society. Utopia, on the other hand, is that ideal state which we all strive towards. As a race still in the process of developing itself, it would perhaps be very premature to let go of the dream of inclusive growth. Society, by its very definition, implies a coming together of a variety of peoples. For growth at any level to be sustainable, it needs to take into account all these pluralities. This realization has made us wiser today of the consequences of our actions, and thus collective movement towards this seeming utopia is well underway, as is evident from the example of the 11th plan approach paper, according to which a key element of the strategy for inclusive growth must be to provide the mass of our people access to basic facilities such as health, education, clean drinking water, etc., and that governments at different levels have to ensure the provision of these services. The thrust of the Prime Minister's Independence Day speech was that the economic benefits accrued as a result of globalization should be inclusive, and that the issues of employment generation, poverty reduction, and human development must be addressed. India's growth since 2003 has been phenomenal and represents a structural increase rather than a cyclical one, which indicates that inclusive growth has been on the agenda. India's sustainable growth rate resulting from increased openness is projected at an average of 8.4% until 2020. This openness has provided access to superior inputs to domestic firms and encouraged a shift in employment from the less productive agricultural sector to more productive sectors, and thus has created a demand for more skilled labor, thus focusing on the significance of education. Perhaps the best example of inclusive and holistic growth can be provided by the experimental township of Auroville, where people of all countries live in progressive harmony above all politics and all nationalities. Here, the very meaning of progress is to take everyone in the march forward. Sure, utopia is not on the cards right now, but the fact of the matter is that society develops only if every individual in it develops in their unique way. We cannot sit back and harp on how the world is witnessing unidimensional progress because that will not solve the problem anyway. We as humans have realized the need to be equitable in our actions because otherwise we would be a race perpetually at war with each other and with anarchy all around. And since these are luxuries we can ill afford, inclusive growth is the only way forward. For instance, It is heartening to see that the Asia and Pacific region has made remarkable progress in reducing poverty. In the 1970s, more than half of the region's population lived on $1 or less per person each day. By 1990, that population had reduced by around 900 million people. The figure is projected to fall to 350 million by 2015. The very fact that absolute poverty levels are declining indicates our commitment towards a holistic society. The question to be asked is it possible to include the most disadvantaged in the production and distribution of products and services? It is, and innovation is the way. At the bottom of the pyramid, access to real opportunities to create wealth has the potential to transform lives in an inclusive way. Sectors such as healthcare, energy, clean water, education, and housing present opportunities that are ripe for innovation. In a vibrant democracy such as ours, it is important that the better off sections of society realize their wider social responsibility. For India to be a global player, it is essential to understand the need to make our growth process, as the Prime Minister said in his recent Confederation of Indian Industry address, more inclusive, to save more and waste less, to care for those who are less privileged and less well off, to be role models of probity, moderation, and charity. The world today is faced with a choice between holistic development and absolute anarchy. According to Uttara Balakrishnan, we have chosen to walk the thin line between economic and social growth, and if we are to realize our dreams, it is only through the harmony between these two. As pointed out in the 10-point charter by the Prime Minister, we need to invest in the workers' welfare, to be proactive in offering jobs to the underprivileged, to give equal status to women, invest in people and in their skills, because high rates of growth mean nothing for those who are unable to find employment and fight corruption at all levels. Today we have the responsibility of creating a culture of caring, sharing, and belonging, and being the eternal optimist, he says he is certain we will not fall short, and that the motto Vasudeva Kutumbakam will indeed resonate the world over.
So, in summary, we can say that inclusive growth is a very important, very realistic, very relevant objective for Indian economic growth. Whether or not we continue with the Planning Commission, inclusive growth will have to be continued for the welfare and development of the Indian economy.